Okay, and then also I can do a screen share with the text. Good. Let's make it full screen. And then, oh, there we go. This can go down here, right? Yeah. Or even just minimize that. Okay. Oh, let's go. So where are we? Well, we're learning about the practice of operating differently than before. Before it was letting me zoom in. Oh, what's going on today? There we go. Okay. I think I had to come out of full screen. Either way, we're learning about this practice of, it can be called fortitude, patience, or resilience even. That's the wrong one. Oh, where did we go? Okay, let's go back to the table of contents. Huh. This whole thing is different. What happened? Okay. I don't know what happened exactly, but it's just like acting up a little. Who knows? I really don't know. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, the other version also should be a table of contents with enthusiasm is after patience. Okay, there we go. This is it. Okay, so we're talking about this practice, which really just means what again? Right? What is this resilience, this patience that we're talking about? Well, essentially, it is the opposite of anger. It is a mental state, or you can say it's like a mental element, right? Something, I'm just doing some review here, but it's always good to do, right? Something which is so something which is, a factor of the mind, right? In all moments, we have many different minds operating, right? There's not just one, you know, big, big picture mind that somehow is kind of always present and always the same, and that it just sort of goes through different phases of experiences, and it's always there as this kind of lump of mind or consciousness, right? Instead, how does consciousness exist? Well, it's something that is generated and regenerated anew in every single moment. Well, why is it like that? Well, because it's something that depends on conditions. So something that depends on causes and conditions. Now, this is getting into philosophy here, but the funny thing is, if we don't really think about the way things exist and how things arise, then it's going to be very hard to really control our anger and really kind of fully overcome it. Again, anger covering the full spectrum of that kind of mental factor, or you can call it a mental element, that emotion, right? So the kind of emotion of anger, which is sort of just lashing out. I don't want it, don't like, go away, destroy it, right? The classical texts use the phrasing of a wish to harm an object. Object just meaning anything that the mind engages with, interacts with, right? Doesn't mean a physical thing. Any person, any idea, any place, any feeling, any, right? Your own suffering, your own illness, whatever it is, that's the object of your anger. And the anger is this wish to harm, but it's not like a thought out wish necessarily that, oh, I want them to die. Not necessarily, of course that can be. That's a very strong form of anger, right? That's like a cruel and hating form of anger. But even just a little irritation, right? A little bit of annoyance, a subtle disturbance to your peace of mind where you're just like, you know, in that state of blah, 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 that little vibration of irritation that stays with you. Oh, why did they do that? I can't believe they said that. Oh, that little thought, that little voice running through your mind. I hate when they say things like that. I hate when they call me out, when they criticize me, you know, always criticizing me, always on my case, right? It's that attitude, that emotion that just has that sense of lashing out. And the problem with it is that it's always over exaggerated, right? This doesn't imply that there are no negative events, that suffering doesn't exist, that there aren't situations that are unjust or unfair or problematic. It doesn't imply that. It implies that when your mind is experiencing that kind of emotion, this quality of this irritation, annoyance, anger, that there is some degree of over exaggeration there. In other words, not really understanding the full picture. Because if we really understood the full picture, then the mind would naturally find peace. Why? Because you would see, well, there's the situation that I don't like, but, well, it's impermanent. There's the situation that I don't like, but, well, as I'm saying about causes, things arising from causes, the causes for it came together, the conditions for it came together, therefore it had no choice but to arise, right? You get a seed, right? Seed for an apple tree, you put it in good soil with the right fertilizer, the right temperature, it has moisture, has everything it needs. You can't stop it from growing, right? When all the conditions are there, right? And the only way is to remove one of the conditions. But once the conditions are there, you can't stop it, right? In that very moment when all the conditions are just right, then it's too late. You can't stop it from giving birth to a sprout. So whatever situation that we don't like, right? If we really are thinking deeply about just the nature of that situation or person or word or that occurrence, well, it just arose because the conditions for it were there. That's just nature. In other words, seeing things as in this naturalistic way, recognizing that the causes and conditions, once they come together, the result will arise. There's no way to stop it. That itself that's a kind of like philosophy or scientific thought, right? Philosophical or scientific thought. So when we really reflect on that, and again, using the real life examples of the things that we get angry at, like our real life, and sort of meditating in this way would be an analytical meditation where we're remembering some situation and thinking about all the different conditions that led to it and thinking about our reaction and how we came to um, react that way and thinking about how we're over exaggerating some negative aspect of it, right? That's a kind of meditation. So when we think that way, we're doing an analysis, a philosophical or scientific analysis, and that itself is what? Practicing this patience or this resilience. Okay, that is the practice of resilience, doing this kind of thinking. Because why? It helps us to expand our mind. So we're not just focused on that one part of it that we don't like and then blowing it up and saying that's the entirety, right? If it's a person, very, very often, the object of our irritations are people, other people, right? Or animals even. If we have a pet, we might get irritated at, or the neighbor's pet, or whatever it is, you know? We're looking at just one thing that we didn't like, and then conflating that entire person, that entire being with that one act, that one activity, that one word, that one habit, whatever, right? And then just saying that's who the person is and that's why they're bad. And then the anger, is aimed, the anger arises. Okay, so patience and anger, they're both minds, right? And so the mind, I kind of want to, got into that through a little bit of a tangent, but the point being the mind itself, right? The anger itself, or the patience itself, they are also caused entities, right? Caused entities. In other words, they also, right? Once the conditions are there, you can't stop it from arising. Anger itself, mind itself. So consciousness is also like this. It's a type of caused phenomenon, right? It's a phenomenon which depends on causes and conditions. And so for that reason, just so we clearly understand, right? This is why I'm saying this is just so we clearly understand when we're looking in the mind, when we're doing a mindfulness of mind practice, right? Trying to observe and understand our own minds more clearly, it's important that we recognize that just what's happening, right? So what's happening is that every moment there is, right, any one of the, or more than one of the six main consciousnesses, right? The visual or the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, tactile, body, physical, and then your mental consciousnesses, your mental mind, your mental parts of mind. Those are arising and ceasing in every moment, as long as there's, some object for them to experience, and as long as there's, you have your working sense modalities are there, your eyeballs, your inner ear, your cochlea, everything is there. Then as soon as those conditions come, and because we're already have, consciousness within us as human beings, all those conditions come together, then the new moment of consciousness arises. So the same with the mental consciousness or our thoughts and emotions, right? Our thoughts and emotions are all mental consciousnesses. So they're not part of the visual experience, right? We're talking about different domains of experience, right? So it's not part of the visual domain. The visual domain of experience is limited to simply colors and shapes, right? All the things that we ever see with our eyes throughout our whole lives, anywhere we go in the world, what are we seeing? The colors and shapes. is, is there anything other than that we are seeing? I mean, we're seeing, tables and chairs and, statues, right? Paintings, people, excuse me. We're seeing all those things, but through their colors and shapes, right? Because they have color and shape, we're seeing them. Okay, so the mental consciousness is where then thoughts and emotions come in. So that's where things like anger come in and where practice of patience comes in. This is all now in the realm of our mental, right, consciousness. So that though itself, again, it's not just some, big mystical, mysterious, like, I don't know, something out in space that we can't see, or we can't that is some mystery that we can't know. It's important to recognize this because, in kind of contemporary scientific circles, right? Of course, these are people who are, great experts in their respective fields, but looking at whether physicists or biologists, people who are studying some subtopic of, some field of science very intensively, and very brilliant people, and then also have some interest in consciousness, right? Which these days there's a lot, right? Certainly in biology, in neuroscience, and physics, these people that for one reason or another, there's a lot of interest in consciousness. But what's the sort of main thesis that they hold, the main idea that they hold about consciousness? Overall, the biggest idea is simply like, it's a mystery. We don't know what it is. It's a mystery. We don't know what it is. Well, that's actually a sign that they're not really practicing mindfulness, right? That they're not tuning in. They're not attuned to their own conscious experiences that clearly. Point being, you can actually know what your mind is. You have to learn some framework, a little bit of background, you could say, right, knowledge, like from psychology or philosophy, but recognize that if you turn inward, first quiet your mind down a little bit so you have a little more just sensitivity, right? More sensitivity to what's really going on internally. And then you can observe this arising and ceasing process of your own emotions and your own thoughts. And so anger here is this kind of thing. Now, why is that important? Well, let's go back to where we left off. Actually, Carrie, do you know what verse you got to last class? Because I actually haven't seen it.
I think we might have gotten to it, but isn't it 31 and 40?
Whoa, what?
But
All right.
she kind of jumped around.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I don't remember. It was right at the end. She went.
Wow. Oh, okay.
And it was farther down.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can do a little review just to connect to what I was saying, just to bring it all together. Okay. Oh, is there a question?
I have a question about consciousness and then your sense consciousnesses separately. So, your sense consciousnesses, or even while you're meditating, you're focusing just on your mental consciousness. But prior to that experience, do initiators of emotion or any feelings or anger initially come through you from your sense consciousnesses? And then it becomes a mental consciousness. So you have that information in your mind to meditate on. But you know what I'm saying? I'm not being that clear.
I mean, everything that we experience as human beings, right, is on some level connected to our sense consciousnesses because we're embodied in a physical form, right?
There's no direct, your mental consciousness does not bring in information without having prior input from your sense consciousnesses.
What do you think?
I disagree with that.
Okay.
I think you can experience mental consciousness objects that don't arise from the 5 physical sense bases. What would be an example?
Dreaming.
There you go.
Dreaming, right.
But the knowledge and dreaming is usually, for me, is visuals, sounds.
Right. That too.
Yeah.
Well, so maybe it's like
Weird mixed up.
in some level, it depends on, when we look at causality, which we will look at a little bit today. We'll talk more about just general principles of causality. But when we look at causality, right, a very general kind of big picture, right, way of categorizing types of causes would be looking at a direct cause versus an indirect cause of something, right? So let's look at this dream, or say you're dreaming of a tiger. Okay, so some dream tiger. Okay, so the dream tiger, well, the appearance of the tiger in the dream, right? There's direct causes, and then there are also indirect causes. So I would say probably in some way, if we really go back, what's the difference between the direct cause and the indirect cause? It's simply the timing, right? If the cause was directly prior, right? If it's consecutive order, you have, cause A and then the result is B, this appearance of a tiger, then that's a direct cause of it. If there's any intervening causes, any intervening moments, then it becomes an indirect cause. Okay, so if it's A, B, and then C, if C is the appearance of this dream tiger and A is the cause you're looking at, then there's an intervening B, another cause, that A would be the indirect cause, So it seems like probably if we're looking at these kinds of mental objects or appearances like in a dream, there's probably some A, right? Some indirect cause. And it could be weeks ago, days ago, it could be from a prior lifetime even, right? That was connected to a sensory consciousness or a sensory experience. I mean, like to have an appearance of a tiger, we need to kind of know what a tiger looks like, right? So how do we know what a tiger looks like? We have to have seen it at some point, or even heard a description and somehow put it together, but then we've heard, right? Or we've read, or somehow there's been some sensory input and connected to that. But it wouldn't have to be in the very next moment, right? It wouldn't have to be a direct result. So when you're talking about anger, right? So, oftentimes we hear someone say something, we see them do something, right? Or you have a physical pain, you fall down and, bust your elbow, you scrape, scrape your knee. Ow, you get angry at the pain or at the object you hit. So that's direct, that would be, right? You have an immediate sensory consciousness, immediately subsequent to that, you have a reaction of anger. So that in that case, yeah, there's just this kind of sensory input, the mental consciousness then, elaborates on that, right? Picks something out to exaggerate, some negative aspect of it, some suffering that you didn't like, anger arises. But it doesn't have to be direct like that, right?
It's kind of hard to come up with examples that aren't like that.
Right.
I can think of, for example, an abstract mathematical idea. I don't really associate so much with any of the 5 sense spaces. Although I can see writing it on a chalkboard in mathematical symbols. So that's a very interesting point.
Yeah, at some level, it has to come back to just because the fact that to be able to come up with a mathematical idea, well, you need to know language, you need to have learned about some prior concepts in math. So there's been some input from at least hearing, learning, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, usually when we're talking about mathematical objects, it's also well, again, like the very basic mathematical constructs, like whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, and then basic arithmetic, adding 1 plus 1. That is based on perceiving, objects, physical things, and then saying, okay, well, 1 and then 1 together is 2. It's sort of like on a fundamental kind of level, right? But yeah,
So
makes sense.
What if we were meditating and you could feel the anger rising,
Right,
but you weren't sure where that was coming from?
right.
Being sort of that sort of non-physical thing, because it's
Right. In that exact moment, there's no discernible, right, sensory consciousness or physical object that's causing it. Sure, sure. I'm just saying in a more fundamental way, at some point, if you really trace all the causes and conditions back, there would be some interaction with the sensory consciousness. But right, in that time, in that to practice with that, then it's really good to just really ask yourself, right? Take some space, give yourself enough time to ask yourself, why am I angry? And then oftentimes your natural capacity for wisdom, right? Your natural ability for wisdom will just sort of help direct you and guide you to find out. It will maybe spur some memory. So maybe you'll think back to, oh, well, yesterday this or that was happening, or oh, I'm mourning this or that loss, or you know, something will come to mind that might help you resolve it and at least understand more clearly why you're getting angry. Yes.
So if you're, highly realizing you have a direct perception of emptiness, is that, so that direct perception of emptiness, I'm assuming really is just in the mental consciousness, but before all of that, you studied what does emptiness mean? And is emptiness even connected to, language? I mean, your ability to get there, not the actual perception of it, but the ability to get to the perception would be based also on learning, right? So, I mean, what is
Right, of course. So,
but is the direct perception
and
this would not be directly connecting sense perception? That's true, right?
not directly, right? So this is an advanced question, but it's referring to, so emptiness again, we've briefly gone into it, is, well, the ultimate nature of all things, all phenomena. But it really refers to, and it is connected to what we're talking about causes and conditions, because it refers to the simple fact that whatever exists is a contingent and emergent object, contingent and emergent phenomenon that is empty of, why emptiness? Because things are empty of an independent nature. So something that could exist or subsist in and of itself without relying on any other conditions or any other objects. That things are empty of that. In other words, nothing has that kind of ability or that kind of nature. So you can learn about this concept, this fact, and you can put your mind on it and you can analyze it. And then once you have analyzed it thoroughly, you have the kind of definite knowledge, and then you can focus single pointedly over time, and that will lead to a direct perception of it, which is something that's sort of like seeing as clearly with your eyes. Like we call the visual consciousness as a kind of direct perception. It means you can see things very clearly. It's different from when you close your eyes and remember it, right? You look at, this statue here, and you can look at it with your eyes, and then you close your eyes and imagine it, remember it. Well, there's a difference, right? One's more clear, more vivid. So you can have that kind of vivid clarity about something even as abstract as this sort of fact of nature. Now, how does that arise, right? Is that direct perception? It's a mental consciousness, something you train your mind to develop. Is that then related to a sensory consciousness? Well, how does wisdom in general arise? Wisdom, or how does this kind of deep knowledge arise? Well, there's 3 steps, right? So we have wisdom that comes from learning, from external sources. Then the wisdom of, can call it sort of internalization, where we really reflect, analyze deeply. And then the wisdom of meditation or training. So you just train your mind single pointedly on that aspect of reality or that thing. It could be impermanence, selflessness, or emptiness, right? And then that brings a direct perception. So if you're going through those 3 kinds of wisdom and you recognize that they come, you have to have this first one in order to have the other 2. Well, what do you have to have first? This wisdom that comes from learning, from external sources. So of course, if you're going to learn about emptiness, you have to have a visual consciousness or, an auditory consciousness, hearing some explanation, right? Or reading some book. So yeah, of course you have to start that way. Now, of course, the wisdom is mental. The wisdom itself is something happening in your mind. But when you're listening to an explanation of emptiness, then you have that, oh, this makes sense. Okay, you're having this thought process go on. That's the wisdom that comes from learning. The wisdom that comes from learning. Then when you take that and you go and you really analyze deeply through meditation or through discussion and dialogue, or what we do in the Tibetan tradition is debate, a very structured form of debate, which hopefully if you're interested, you can all learn. if you'd like to, Geshe Mahadran is obviously very skilled. She's been doing it for over 20 years, it's because it's done daily in the monastic system. Anyway, it's a specific form of dialoguing, essentially, right? Discussing something. So that's the second level where you're gaining wisdom through your analysis, right? The wisdom of contemplating and analyzing. So then that's also mental consciousness, right? The process of discussing, process of debating, that's right. You're using your speech, obviously, so you're using your auditory consciousness to hear the words, but the thoughts, right? The thought process going on, that's mental consciousness, and then that wisdom or that understanding that arises. And so then that's wisdom arising from meditation. That's the one out of the three that's most obviously mental consciousness, because you're not even talking at that point, right? You're not listening to some explanation, you're not talking, you're really just sitting there, somewhere in a still place where you're really just directing your mind, with the kind of single pointed concentration together with that awareness or wisdom that you've developed before. And then that becomes the wisdom that arises from meditative training. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's go back to connecting this thing about causality to the verses here. So Chandideva, again, I'm not going to do the full review of the full chapter, but the chapter, it really is laid out very beautifully. Once you probably should do it, maybe next week when it will be the last class that I'll be teaching, maybe we can just go through again to get a clear picture of sort of what does each verse do in the chapter? Like, how is it leading through? Okay.
She lumped them.
Oh, good.
I took notes, but it was about how the verses move.
Oh, good. Okay. So you've done that already.
Yeah,
Okay. Excellent. Excellent.
So if we get the video, folks should watch.
Right. Yeah. And I've asked her to upload it, so she will. She just doesn't have time. Yeah.
That's what we went through.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. And that's so valuable because then it helps you organize your own thinking about it, right? It helps you organize your thoughts about it and understand, okay, it helps you understand how to practice the patience because you're seeing all the different components of it, all the different components of the practice, because there's a lot involved. Now let's just do a little bit of review though, but I'll also mention a little bit about causality, another basic kind of important philosophical principle here about causality as it's understood from the Buddhist perspective. So here again, we're going back to verse 22. As I do not become angry with great sources of suffering such as jaundice, then why be angry with animate creatures? They too are provoked by conditions. Although they are not wished for, these sicknesses arise. And likewise, although they are not wished for, these disturbing conceptions forcibly arise. Without thinking I shall be angry, people become angry with no resistance. And without thinking I shall produce myself, likewise, anger itself is produced. All mistakes that are, and all the various kinds of evil, arise through the force of conditions. They do not govern themselves. These conditions that assemble together have no intention to produce anything, and neither does their product have the intention to be produced. Okay, so these verses, how many were there? 22 through 26, so about 5 verses, right? So these are really showing how to do this kind of deeper reflection on just the simple nature of caused events or caused entities, and how to use that understanding to overcome anger. Well, why? Well, again, it's using an analogy, but it really is like the exact same situation when you really think about it. We don't get angry at, again, typically, right? Remember what I said before? Okay, you can actually get angry at anything. You can get angry at things that don't even exist, right? You can get angry at the boogeyman in your closet. Like, you can get angry at anything, right? But typically, right, like if you get some stomach ache, you don't get angry at the stomach ache or the bacteria or whatever, right? If you get, a disease, you don't really get angry at the disease, right? Why? Well, because we recognize it's just this natural event that happened. You can't really control it. Of course, there are some things we can do to reduce our chances of disease, but you can't fully control it, right? There's just conditions that are there, and then those results come. Those illnesses come. So why be angry with animate creatures, right? They too are provoked by conditions. So what Shantideva was doing is showing us that we give so much more credit to living beings, to people, for their actions than we give to something like a disease. But in reality, they're both just subject to the conditions that gave rise to them. So it's like we superimpose this extra degree of like responsibility onto onto people, right? But when if we're honest and we look at ourselves, like we make mistakes too. We do things that other people won't like, or that we even, get angry at ourselves for sometimes. But certainly we'll do things that other people consider to be the wrong action, a bad thing, an unethical thing even. They'll get angry at us. But when we really look inside, it's like, well, I mean, that's just what I did. I had that emotional state. I had that belief so that I was acting on. It just was there. It was part of me, and then I did that action. Like when you really look at the sort of causal nexus, right, that gives rise to any particular action you do, it's not like there is some, you know, completely independent director of the show that's inside there, and they're either inherently evil or they're inherently good, and they're doing all these actions that people don't like, right? It's these conditions that come together. Just like when you get a stomach ache or a cancer or jaundice, as it says here. So although they are not wished for, these sicknesses arise, and likewise, although they are not wished for, these disturbing conceptions forcibly arise. Right? So what it means, these disturbing conceptions, it means, right, like now, if we're talking about getting angry at another person, well, it's because they did something that we didn't like or that was harmful, but they're doing the harmful thing because of their disturbing conceptions, right? In other words, again, there's not some little, have you ever heard of the word homunculus? Maybe not, but it was well, it was a concept that was actually believed in medieval Europe, that there was like a little person somewhere in the brain that was basically, I mean, even going back to the start of neuroscience, there was a very similar notion to this. Well, so at first it wasn't in the brain, it was just like somewhere within the body. There was like a little person who sort of was controlling. But then this even evolved into, once people started understanding the importance of the brain and understanding that it kind of carries over to today, if you really look at it, that like each region of the brain is responsible for, like, one region's for my right hand and one region is responsible for my left hand, and for my, sort of mapped onto different regions of the brain is your body. And there's that little, and that's really, right, that when you look at like the map of the brain, that's really what's in control and doing everything, right? But the funny thing is, again, there's not some like little person in there. Again, it's just all these different conditions coming together, and constantly changing and constantly, right, depending on their own unique collection of conditions. So what is it that I wanted to mention today? It was about just a general principle of causality to help us understand what's happening, right? When someone does something we don't like, when our own anger arises, for anything, right? All of the causal entities, the entities that are involved in cause and effect, they all are subject to the same basic principles of causality. So what's one? It's the principle of impermanence, The second one is the principle of potential or potentiality. And then the third one is, this is kind of a technical term, but I'll explain it. The principle of not being moved. And I'll just explain what that means. But the first one is impermanence, right? So this is just the basic principle that all the causes and conditions all the results that arise, right? So we're looking at our own anger, we're looking at the thing we're angry at, whichever, right? In this case of meditating on patience, they're both important to look at. But you can see that object of your anger, for instance, that person, for instance, right? They arose from causes and conditions. Those causes and conditions were necessarily impermanent. Impermanent. So, what would be the problem, or problem meaning like logical contradiction, that kind of problem? What would be the logical contradiction if there were permanent causes that gave rise to something? Now, this is a view that people have, not just in the Western. I mean, we have the notion that God is permanent, that there's a permanent God who created the universe, right? It's not just in the Western world. In ancient India, there were many people, many philosophical systems, and present-day India too, which had a very similar notion. Specific details are a little different, but a very similar notion that there's some kind of universal, maybe energy or universal substance, which is permanent, but itself gives rise to all the people, the world, right? Nature. So it's like God. It's called by a slightly different name, maybe. What's the problem with that idea? The logical problem.
Talking about theistic dogmatism.
Just as a logical proposition, just as a philosophical proposition, whatever else we want to call it, let's just entertain the notion, right? It kind of makes sense. Like, let's take the other side, right? Let's take the side of someone who's promoting this kind of idea. Well, we look all around us, and right, we see all these unique things, all these unique people, all these unique objects, and they all have their own unique function, right? But also they all come and go. They all come and go. So there's got to be something underlying all of that, right? There's got to be something that is the substrate, the basis for all this coming and going of all this diversity, right? Right. So what could that basis be? Well, there's some universal energy that's underlying everything, and everything is a manifestation of this energy. The energy just stays the same. It's permanent. It can't change. But it's what is giving rise to all these different manifestations, all these different expressions. Everything that we see is an expression of this universal God, this universal substance. It makes sense, right?
It doesn't make sense. That's why there is the popular phrase, God works in mysterious ways. Because in fact, it doesn't make sense.
Okay. But I guess what I'm saying is you could be convinced by it. You could see how someone could be convinced by it, especially because we have a natural, as many humans just like have a natural inclination, we can say, towards like wanting to believe in something deeper, right? We want to be able to trust in something, or just even, recognize that there's something beyond these shifting, changing appearances. I think that's just a natural tendency. So someone comes out with a view like this, a theory like this, well, sounds good, yeah. And then of course you can also go and sit, meditate on it, think about it, and feel like your body's dissolving, your personhood's dissolving, and you're just being one with this universal presence, this universal substance. And then it feels good because you're not so clinging strongly to yourself, right? So it actually has, it can have a positive psychological impact even, right? And of course, billions of people across the world get positive psychological benefit from belief in something like this, or God or something. But what's the real logical problem? It just comes down to simply looking at what it means to arise, what it means to be a result. What is causality even, like, what's happening when we talk about causality, right? Okay, so when you talk about causality, right, let's look really simply at the arising of a sprout from a seed. So the sprout is arising from the seed. Now, the moment that the sprout arises, right, is it arising? Let's just say, first question, is a sprout arising all the time in all places everywhere? A sprout of an apple tree? No.
Mhm.
So that means then it's only arising in a specific time at a specific place, right? So if it's only arising at a specific time in a specific place, well, there must be a reason for that. Why? What is the reason? Well, because the specific conditions that allow or that enable that apple tree's sprout to arise are only there at that specific time and place, right? In the middle of my hand, in my palm right now, there aren't all the conditions for an apple tree to arise, so it's not. There's no apple tree growing in my palm right now. Outside in the apple orchard where they planted one and all the conditions are right, there is one arising. So that means that in that moment of the very first moment of the arising of this apple tree, or this sprout, then the conditions had to be exactly right for that to arise. Well, what does that mean though? It arose, say, let's just pretend 12 a.m. this morning, right? Exactly at 12 a.m. is when this tree started to grow out of the seed. Well, why didn't it arise at 11:59 p.m. or 11:58 p.m.? Well, the conditions hadn't yet been exactly right for it to arise. There still needed to be some condition to come into this collection of causes and conditions to be just right for an apple seed to sprout. So if that's the case, then all those conditions also, we have to understand, had to change, right? In one moment, they were not able to give rise to the apple tree, to the sprout. And the next moment, right at 12 a.m., they were able to give rise to the sprout. If they were unchanging, they never would have transformed into the state where they could give rise to the sprout. So the sprout itself is impermanent because it's only arising in one place at one time. But its conditions, its causes also have to be changing and impermanent, or else they can never change into something that's suitable, something that's able to create the sprout, right? They would always be, right, in the moment before they created the sprout, they're not creating a sprout. So they would always be, if they're permanent and unchanging, they would always be in a state of not creating a sprout. Well, it's the same if you apply it to, if you are thinking of something like the possibility that there could be God, but you really think about what it means to create something. What does it mean to create a universe, to create a person? Well, if you're really creating, there had to be some change in the creator. Because in one moment they're not creating, and the next moment they're creating. That's a change, going from the state of non-creation to a state to non-creating to a state of creating, right? So that's how all the conditions are. So the very notion of a permanent creator, when you really just look at what causality means, the notion of a permanent creator is simply a logically inconsistent or contradictory notion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's one of the conditions or one of the principles of causality, right? The principle of impermanence. Okay, another principle, and I'll go through this quickly because time's up, but another principle is what's called potentiality. So this just means that a mango seed is not going to give rise to an apple tree, and an apple seed is not going to give rise to an orange tree, right? For something to give rise, something to create a result, it has to have some potential for that to create that result, right? And this is especially important when we're looking at things like our happiness and suffering, recognizing that negative actions or non-virtue does not have the potential to create happiness. And virtue and happiness only can come from virtuous or positive actions. And likewise, virtue does not have the potential to give rise to suffering, right? The same with things like if we really want, the ultimate happiness, like complete freedom from anger, right? I mean, if we want complete freedom from anger, we have to think about what is the kind of condition, what is the kind of cause that can give rise to that result? What kind of cause has the potential to give rise to that result? Does killing all of your enemies have the potential to give rise to the result of freedom from anger, freedom from problems? So you have to think about this. So potential. This is the principle of potentiality. The next one is the principle of what I said is non-movement, right? Now this actually refers to a notion of God, as understood in the ancient Indian philosophy, which usually use the word Ishvara, or there's several different terms, but it's a popular version. So it would be simply saying that in those systems of philosophy, right, something arises by the will of the creator, right, or the desire of the creator. In other words, the movement of the creator's mind. The movement of the creator's mind is what gives rise to the world, to beings. So then simply saying this principle of conditionality, of non-movement, it simply means that things that arise are not created by the movement in the mind of the creator. So it's really just a direct, negation of that belief system or that idea. But again, it makes sense when you really think through it logically. Okay, so those are three principles of causality, which are taught in the Abhidharma, and they're also taught in the Pramanavartika. Okay, so I think time is up. So let's just see if there's any questions. If anyone needs to leave, feel free to leave. And then are there any questions? Okay, if not, then we can do a dedication. So actually, let's do a minute of meditation, okay? So just reflect on what was talked about today and try to apply it. So think of a situation where you got angry, okay? Or you got upset or annoyed. It doesn't have to be extremely intense, burning hatred, just any kind of annoyance or irritation, frustration. And then think about what you are angry at. What is the object of that anger or frustration? Okay, and now apply this logical analysis of causality. Just seeing that thing you're angry at in relation to all the conditions that brought it about. And recognizing that if there are the causes without any cause incomplete, then who could possibly reverse the result? Who could possibly stop the result from coming? So instead of there being any single controller, whether we're thinking of a God or whether we're thinking of that person's, innate self or soul or some, true essence of the person themselves, whatever it is, there is not some kind of singular controller that makes everything happen, that makes that person or that thing happen, and that could have stopped it. Instead, it's just conditions and causes. that bring about the events, the behaviors, the words, the thoughts, the emotions. And then just by thinking of that, just allow yourself to, well, just experiment with it. See what does it do? How does it change your feeling? And then especially just spend a moment to remember forgiveness. Forgiveness is also a type of patience. And when we can have forgiveness, really what it means is that we are letting go of our anger. And since our anger is really harming our own mind, our own peace of mind, it's like burning ourselves. Then when we let go of it, then we're free. So give yourself permission to have forgiveness, okay? You're giving yourself a gift at the same time as you're giving the person that you are upset with a gift, because you're not blaming and judging them anymore. You're recognizing them just as this being who wants to be happy and doesn't want to suffering. You're acknowledging their true nature. And you're also giving yourself permission to be at peace. Okay, now dedicate any virtue that we've created. Virtue means just the positivity, the good energy or potential that we've generated from trying to make the world a better place, trying to make our minds happier and more content, more compassionate and kind. So just offer all of that positivity out to all living beings. We can do the prayers in Tibetan if anyone knows them. Changchu Sancho Rinpoche Ma Ge Panam Ge Gyurchi Ge Banyam Pa Me Ba Yang Gong Ne Gong Du Pewar Sho Kangri Rawe Korwe Shen Kam Dir Pendang Dewa Malu Jungwe Ne Chenre Zik Wang Tenzin Gyatso Yi Sharpe Si Te Parlu Ten Gyurchi. And then in English, due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forever. Okay, thank you. Okay, goodbye to those of you online.